Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a touching journey of love, trust, and redemption, in a world where wealth and success often mask the emptiness within. Jack Harrington, a successful businessman, discovers that the most valuable things in life aren't measured in money. When he meets Emily, a homeless young woman with a heart full of strength and untold pain, their paths collide in unexpected ways. Together, they begin to rebuild what was lost, learning that real connections are born from vulnerability and understanding. Stay tuned as we unfold a story that will touch your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to start the story today. Jack Harrington sat in his Manhattan penthouse, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. The relentless rain poured down in sheets, blurring the iconic skyline that he usually admired so much. But tonight, it looked like a shadowy blur in the distance, distant and cold, much like the emptiness he felt inside. His luxurious home, with its gleaming marble countertops and pristine leather furniture, felt more like a museum than a living space. Everything was polished, untouched, as if this was a place designed for display, not for comfort. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the city below and the occasional crackle from the dying embers in his fireplace. He had everything: wealth, power, influence. He could have whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Yet, as he sat in his chair, watching the storm rage outside, Jack realized how little all of it mattered. It couldn't fill the hollow void that had been inside him for years. It was an ache in his chest, deep and familiar, one that he'd carried since betrayal had shattered his trust. That night was no different than any other. The ache was there, the same dull weight he had grown used to over the years. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. He rose slowly from his chair, leaving the warmth of the fire behind, and made his way to the door. Another long, empty night, another night spent alone, just like every other. Jack had learned long ago that comfort was something he no longer needed. He had been burned by people too many times to trust anyone. And now, as he grabbed his coat and car keys, he decided that maybe a late-night drive through the rain would offer him some respite. Or at least a temporary escape. The streets were nearly empty, the rain turning the sidewalks into shimmering rivers as Jack's sleek black car glided through the damp streets. The sound of the tires against the wet road was the only noise that seemed to fill the void. Jack's mind raced, caught in the swirl of memories and doubts, trying to push aside the thoughts that had haunted him for years. He pulled into the underground parking garage beneath his building, the hum of the engine dying as he switched off the ignition. But then something caught his eye, a shadow in the dimly lit alleyway. At first, he thought it was just a pile of discarded clothing left in the rain. But as his headlights swept over it, he realized it was a person, a young woman, curled up against the damp brick wall. Her knees were drawn to her chest, her body trembling beneath an oversized hoodie. She was soaked through, shivering uncontrollably. Jack's stomach tightened. He didn't get involved. He never did. That was the rule. The world had shown him enough of its darkness that he had learned to keep his distance. But something about the way she hugged herself, the way her face was hidden in her arms, struck a chord deep within him. It felt wrong to just drive away. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, his mind weighing the decision. It was late, the streets empty, and this wasn't his problem. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it was. The rain hit him like a cold slap as he stepped out of the car, his shoes splashing through the puddles as he approached the alley. His heart raced, not just from the physical discomfort of the rain but from the weight of the choice he was about to make. He could walk away. It would be easier, safer, but for reasons he couldn't understand, he couldn't. "Hey," he called out, his voice firm but not unkind. The girl startled, shrinking further into the shadows. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jack added quickly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. She looked up, and their eyes met. Her face was pale beneath the damp, tangled strands of hair that framed it, but there was a clarity in her eyes, a defiance, even in this vulnerable state. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse from the cold, her tone edged with pride. Clearly, You're not fine, Jack replied, his gaze sweeping over her soaked clothes. She shivered violently. How long have you been out here? The girl paused for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Since this afternoon. Jack exhaled slowly, his gaze scanning her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. She couldn't stay out here any longer. Look, he said, his voice softening, I'm not calling the cops. But you can't stay here. It's dangerous. Come inside, just warm up, take a shower, and then you can go. The girl hesitated. Jack could see the suspicion flickering behind her eyes. But after a long pause, she gave a small, reluctant nod. Okay, just for a little while. Jack led her through the back entrance of the building, guiding her toward the elevator that opened directly into his penthouse. It felt strange, bringing a stranger into his home. He wasn't careless. He had learned to be careful, to guard himself. But something about this girl, her quiet dignity, the way she had looked at him with such defiance, stirred something inside him. Something unexpected. He didn't know what it was. But he couldn't turn away. Inside, Emily, that was what she told him her name was, stood awkwardly near the door. Her arms tightly wrapped around herself as if to shield her from the world. Jack handed her a towel, gesturing toward the hallway. Through there, there's a robe you can use. I'll get you something warm to drink. She nodded without a word and disappeared down the hall. Jack released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. What was he doing? Letting a homeless stranger into his home? But something about her, her pride, her vulnerability, it stirred something inside him. It wasn't pity. No, it was something more. It was a connection, an unspoken understanding, and he didn't know how to name it. But he couldn't walk away now. He busied himself in the kitchen, brewing tea, his thoughts racing. Who was she, really? What had brought her here? Why did he feel this strange pull to help her? Jack couldn't explain it, but as the sound of running water echoed from the bathroom, he found himself drawn to the hallway, wondering what would happen next. Tonight had started like any other, empty, lonely, and quiet, but somehow, this girl, this stranger, had already begun to shift something inside him. Something he wasn't ready to face. Not yet, but the storm outside was raging. And for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel quite so alone. The minutes that followed felt like hours. The silence between Jack and Emily thick with unspoken tension. He could hear the sound of water running from the bathroom as Emily washed away the cold and the rain that had soaked her to the bone. Jack sat in the living room, absent-mindedly stirring the tea he had made, trying to keep his mind occupied. But it was no use. His thoughts kept drifting back to her, to Emily. She was just a girl, someone down on her luck. But there was something about her that intrigued him. He couldn't explain it. In all the years he had spent carefully building the walls around his heart, this stranger, this young woman with her defiant eyes, had already begun to chip away at them. Her pride, the way she had spoken to him without desperation or pleading, it had reminded him of himself, of the way he once was. Before life had taught him that trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered. Jack shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. He had no business feeling this way. People didn't change, and neither did circumstances. He had learned that lesson the hard way. His eyes flickered to the windows, where the storm outside still raged. He wasn't sure why he had brought her here. Maybe it was empathy, or maybe it was something deeper. But the nagging feeling that he shouldn't have involved himself in her life lingered in the back of his mind. The sound of the bathroom door opening broke his reverie. Jack turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her damp hair now neatly braided. The oversized robe she had borrowed cinched tightly around her waist. She looked different, softer somehow, as if the warmth of the shower had given her a semblance of peace, even if it was temporary. But what struck Jack most was the way she held herself. Her shoulders were squared, her gaze wary, as if bracing herself for rejection. "Feel better?" Jack asked, his voice low, unsure of how to continue the conversation. He felt awkward, not knowing how to act with someone who was both a stranger and, in some ways, a reflection of the person he used to be. Emily nodded, though she didn't say anything in response. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the robe, almost as though she were trying to make herself smaller. She seemed hesitant, unsure of where she stood in his world now that she was inside his penthouse. Jack gestured toward the steaming cup of tea he had placed on the marble countertop earlier. I made tea, if you want some. Her eyes flickered toward the cup, but she hesitated before stepping forward. Jack could see the uncertainty in her movements. She took the cup, her fingers wrapping around it to absorb the warmth. Though she barely made eye contact with him, she muttered a quiet thank you. But Jack could tell that the walls between them were still there, thick and impenetrable. They stood in silence for a few moments, the rain outside the only sound filling the room. Jack's mind raced, his thoughts colliding with the memories of the betrayal he had suffered years ago. He could feel the walls he had built around himself creeping back up, the fear and mistrust settling in his chest once more. He had been burned before, and the thought of trusting anyone again, even Emily, seemed impossible. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I should go, she said, her words quiet but resolute. You've done more than enough. I don't want to impose. Jack felt a pang in his chest at her words. He didn't want her to leave. The thought of her walking out into the storm, back into the cold night, twisted something inside him, but he couldn't let her go. Not like this. You don't have anywhere to go, do you? Jack asked, his voice gentler now, though the question felt heavy in the air. She paused for a moment, as though deciding whether to answer him honestly. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and Jack saw her fingers clench around the fabric of the robe. No, she whispered, the word heavy with the weight of unspoken pain. But that's not your problem. I'll figure it out. Jack shook his head, the urgency rising in his chest. It's not safe, Emily, not out there, please. Just stay for tonight. It's just one night. You can leave in the morning if you want. Her eyes flickered with hesitation, and for a moment, Jack thought she might walk away. But then she met his gaze, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand his motives. Why are you being so nice to me? She whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Jack's chest tightened, the weight of her question pulling at the fragile threads of trust he had built with her. He didn't know how to answer. The truth was, he didn't know why he was doing this. He didn't trust people. He never had. But something about her, something about the way she had looked at him, had made him want to help. He shrugged, masking the uncertainty with a detached exterior. Everyone deserves a safe place to sleep, he said, his voice steady but soft. Emily didn't speak for a long while. She stood there, as if fighting against the walls she had built, the ones that had kept her from trusting anyone for so long. Finally, with a quiet sigh, she nodded. Okay, she whispered, just tonight. Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him, though it was mingled with the heavy uncertainty of what came next. He pointed toward the guest room down the hall. There are fresh towels and blankets if you need anything. I'll be out here. She nodded, offering him a quiet, thank you, before disappearing down the hallway. The door to the guest room closing softly behind her. Jack sank back onto the couch, a strange sense of exhaustion settling over him. What was he doing? He had opened his door, his home, to a stranger, a homeless girl who, despite her vulnerabilities, had a quiet strength that had drawn him in. He could already feel the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart starting to crack. But even as he sat there, Jack couldn't ignore the lingering doubt. Would he regret this? Would she hurt him, just like everyone else had? He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. All he could do now was wait and see. The days that followed felt different. There was a quiet shift in the air, something unspoken that lingered between Jack and Emily. She had stayed longer than he expected, despite his doubts and the walls that had quickly gone up inside him. Jack had to admit, he couldn't help but be drawn to her. There was something about Emily that both disturbed and fascinated him. Her strength, her resilience, her ability to stand tall in the face of hardship. It reminded him of the person he used to be before life had taught him the sharp, painful lessons about trust. Emily didn't speak much. She remained quiet, wrapped in her own thoughts. And Jack couldn't shake the feeling that she was still holding herself back. He wanted to ask her about her past. Wanted to understand what had brought her to this place. But he hesitated. He was no stranger to pain. He had lived through his own. There was no reason to push her into revealing things she wasn't ready to share. Besides, she hadn't come to him for sympathy. She hadn't asked for anything except a place to stay. And Jack wasn't sure if he could give her anything more than that. Still, there were moments when their conversations drifted to other topics. To simple things, books, movies, small talk about the rain in the city. Jack learned about Emily's dream of starting a small bakery. A dream she had been forced to abandon when her mother became ill. It was a dream Jack understood. He had once dreamed of something simple. Something that wasn't tied to wealth or power. Just the pure satisfaction of building something meaningful. But like Emily, his dreams had been shattered. Betrayal had stolen those ambitions, leaving behind only the hollow ache of what could have been. But despite her quiet nature, there was a fire in Emily's eyes. Something that Jack could see whenever she spoke of her lost dream. It was a reminder that she still had something inside her worth fighting for. And in some strange way, it pulled Jack in deeper. It wasn't just pity. He wasn't helping her out of some misguided sense of charity. No, there was something more, a connection. One evening, Jack found himself standing in the kitchen, staring out at the skyline, the city lights shimmering beneath the rain, thinking about everything that had led him to this point. It wasn't just the wealth that made him feel empty, it was the loneliness that came with it. No matter how much he had, no matter how successful he became, it had never filled the emptiness inside. It was as if the more he acquired, the more isolated he felt from the world around him. The connections he had once longed for had slipped through his fingers. Betrayal had done that. It had taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But as he stood there, watching the rain trickle down the glass, Jack realized something. Maybe that was why he had opened his door to Emily. Maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting for a way to reconnect with something real. Something that wasn't defined by money or power. When Emily had arrived, she had been nothing but a stranger to him. A woman in need, nothing more. But now, after days of quiet companionship, he realized that she was more than that. She wasn't just a homeless girl who needed a place to stay. She was a reminder of the life he had once wanted, of the possibility of redemption, of second chances. And maybe, just maybe, that was what they both needed. Jack had offered Emily a place to stay. But he hadn't expected to find himself in this position, drawn to her strength. Her quiet dignity, her unspoken pain. They both had pasts, dark ones, but they were still standing. And maybe that was enough for now. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and Jack heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Emily standing at the doorway, her hair damp from the shower, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a strange calm in the air, as if they both understood the unspoken truth between them. Emily offered him a small smile. But it wasn't a smile of gratitude or obligation. It was something more, a recognition, perhaps, of the bond they had started to form, despite the walls they both had built around themselves. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe I could try again. The bakery. I know it's a risk. But I want to rebuild. I don't want to just survive anymore." Jack's heart tightened. There was so much more to her than he had first realized. She wasn't just trying to survive, she was fighting to live again. And that was something Jack could respect. Something he could understand. "You don't have to do it alone," Jack said, his voice steady, offering her a chance to trust him, even if it was just a small one. Emily looked at him, her expression softening. She was still guarded, still uncertain, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a glimmer of hope. "Maybe, I know," she whispered. "Maybe I don't." And for the first time in years, Jack felt a small, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. Maybe they could help each other rebuild, piece by fragile piece. The storm outside had finally stopped. And though it had been a long, hard journey, Jack was beginning to understand that some things, like hope, and trust, and the possibility of redemption, were worth fighting for. As the days passed, Jack and Emily began to build something together. Slowly but surely, the past was never far behind, but it no longer defined them. Jack watched as Emily's dream of opening the bakery started to take shape. It wasn't easy. There were countless obstacles along the way, moments of doubt, and struggles to face. But through it all, Emily held on, her resilience growing stronger each day. And Jack, who had once closed himself off from everyone, found himself opening up, learning how to trust again. Not just in her, but in himself as well. They weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. They understood the fragility of trust and the strength it took to heal. Together, they learned that love wasn't about grandeur or wealth, it was about seeing the true heart of someone. Seeing their pain, their struggles, and still choosing to stand by them. The day the bakery doors opened for the first time, it wasn't just a victory for Emily. It was a victory for both of them, for the road they had traveled, for the lessons they had learned, and for the bond they had formed. They had found something real, something worth fighting for. As they stood side by side, watching the first customers walk through the door, Jack realized that the emptiness that once plagued him had vanished. It had been replaced by something stronger, hope. If this heartfelt journey touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the power of compassion. And for more inspiring stories that warm the heart and restore faith in humanity, be sure to subscribe to Life Stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time for another unforgettable story.